This is exercise 27. It deals with the anatomy of the reproductive system. With the reproductive system, a couple of terms that we use: gonads. This is the primary sex organ, so it's going to be the testes in males, the ovaries in females. The gonads are going to produce the gametes. Gametes are what we refer to as the sex cells. So it's going to be the sperm in males, in the ova, or the eggs in females. And the gonads are also secreting various hormones. If we look at the male reproductive system first, you've got the testes. As I just said, that's the primary organ of the male reproductive system. And then you have this whole duct system, which is going to be comprised of the epididymis, the ductus deferens, also sometimes referred to as the vas deferens, and then the urethra. There are accessory structures or organs. There's 3 different glands: the seminal glands, the prostate gland, and the bulbourethral gland. And then in terms of external genitalia, there's the penis and the scrotum. I'll go back to that slide, I'm sorry. Especially as men age, oftentimes the prostate gland becomes inflamed, and that actually presses down and restricts the flow of urine through the prostatic urethra. And this can cause decreased urine output. It may result in more frequent urination. There's medication that can be given to help reduce the inflammation, and then that would increase the flow because it's not constricting on that urethra anymore. The one concern you have to be aware of, especially in older men, they usually recommend above the age of about 45 to 50, is they should have a test run called a PSA, prostate specific antigen test, and that's monitoring for prostate cancer, because typically with prostate cancer, as with a lot of cancers, you get increased growth there. If there's a tumor, that can also compress or restrict the flow of the urine as well. And so you'd want certainly to have a test run if the symptoms are there, to see, is it just an inflamed prostate or is it cancerous? And if it's cancerous, then do whatever appropriate treatment you feel is best in that situation, because there's multiple ways of treating it. When you look at the testes itself in this enlarged picture, you can see the seminiferous tubules, those yellow tubules. That's where the sperm is actually being produced. And then it will move to what the enlarged area, where all those separate tubules, there's like little lobes, and they're called the lobule, and each one will feed into the ruddy testis, which then feeds into the epididymis. By the time the sperm leaves the epididymis, it now has the ability to move. The flagella on it is mature, and it is able to be motile on its own. From there, it's going to move up that ductus deferens, which is going to bring it up into the pelvic cavity. Spermatogenesis is the process of making the sperm cells. This is going to start at puberty, and it continues throughout the entire lifetime of the male. And as I just said, where are the sperm being formed? In those seminiferous tubules. And this is just a quick diagram showing that in the spermatogenesis, you have a stem cell. It is going to go through mitosis and produce 2 cells. One of those daughter cells remains and will continue on producing more stem cells. The other cell, which here is labeled as type B, it's going to move towards the tubule lumen. Now that is the one that ultimately is going to go through spermatogenesis, through the process of meiosis. Meiosis only occurs in the sex cells. For spermatogenesis, what I want you to realize is that for every cell that you start with, every of the daughter cell type B that you start with, you will generate 4 living sperm cells. So now if we move over to the female reproductive system, the main or primary organ is going to be the ovaries. There's 2 ovaries. You have a duct system. This is going to be comprised of the uterine tubes, also known as the fallopian tubes, also known as oviduct. So you can use whichever term you wish. It also is composed of the uterus and the vagina, and then once again you also have external genitalia. In this diagram, a cross-section, you can see the largest structure in the middle is going to be the uterus. It is held in place by multiple different ligaments. It is bent forward. On either side of that, because you have 2 ovaries, so on either side of the uterus, and this will be better seen in a coming up picture in just a moment, you have the ovary. The ovary is just below the uterine tube. The fimbriae are the little finger-like projections on the end of the uterine tube that kind of sit over the ovary. They're not actually physically attached. When they move, they create a current which will draw the egg or the ovum up into the uterine tube or the fallopian tube, which is then going to kind of wrap around and then connect to the uterus. The opening of the uterus is the cervix, so that's the division between the uterus and the vagina. And then the vagina is connecting to the external environment where you have your external genitalia, the labium minus and the labium majoris. With the ovary, this is showing what happens. If you notice in the top, you've got a primary follicle. The eggs or the ovum initially are produced or generated during fetal development, and then it kind of stops or arrests, as we'll see in a moment. Once a woman hits puberty, what happens is the egg is going to be surrounded by additional cells called in what's known as the primary follicle. And then the surrounding cells will continue to grow and help protect that egg. And then it goes through this process of maturing. And roughly once a month, it goes from a primary follicle to a secondary follicle to the vestibular follicle. And finally then, when ovulation occurs, that's when this follicle has ruptured and it releases the egg or the ovum. Where does the egg go? It has to be drawn up into those fallopian tubes. How's it drawn up? Because remember I said the fimbriae, they start moving and that creates a current to draw it up into the fallopian tube. What happens to the remains of that ruptured follicle? It becomes the corpus luteum, which is secreting hormones that will help to prepare the uterus for implantation to occur, and it will help sustain if fertilization does occur and implantation then occurs. It will help sustain that the pregnancy until the placenta is formed to then sustain the pregnancy. In this view, you can see where the ovaries are. Once again, the egg would be released from the ovary, drawn up into the uterine tube or fallopian tube. The egg, once it has been released, will only survive about 12 to 24 hours. So fertilization occurs, it must occur within 24 hours of ovulation. Where does fertilization occur? It occurs in the fallopian tube because the egg will spend about 3 to 4 days in the fallopian tube. So fertilization occurs, it has to occur in the fallopian tubes. Fertilization occurs, that union of the sperm and the egg. The cells will start to dividing, forming 2 cells, then 4 cells, etc. So the development starts. But like I say, the first couple of days it's still in the fallopian tubes. It needs to move down into the uterus. Implantation needs to occur in the uterus. If it occurs in the uterine tube, this is what is often referred to as an ectopic pregnancy, and this is very dangerous. Normally, what will happen is it will be aborted because it's not designed to help nourish and maintain that pregnancy. It's also very dangerous for the woman because obviously the uterine tubes are not designed to increase and swell in size for now the developing fertilized egg. The corpus luteum that remains of the ruptured follicle, like I say, are releasing hormones that have helped, and all the hormones released by the ovary all along have helped prepare the uterus, increasing the endometrium, which is the innermost of the wall of the uterus, to help prepare it so that it can sustain pregnancy. It sustains the implantation. So about a week after fertilization, the fertilized egg has made it down to the uterus and is implanted in the wall. The placenta is not fully formed. It takes a while to form that. It is not fully formed and functioning until about the end of the second month. With all these different changes in the hormones trying to help maintain the pregnancy, number one, these are some of these hormones. The HSG is the one that's testing for pregnancy test, and there have been studies that have shown that high increased levels of these hormones sometimes are what contribute to morning sickness that a woman may feel in the first few months of pregnancy. If fertilization and implantation do not occur, then the egg is going to be sloughed off and released. The endometrium layer, most of it is sloughed off and released in the monthly cycle of the woman, and then the whole process is going to start over again. For women, oogenesis is the process of producing the egg or the ovum. It's a little bit different than in males from the standpoint that instead of starting at puberty, this starts before birth. So in fetal development, you start the process of oogenesis, but very early on it stops. What we call it arrest. It starts the process and then it just stops and holds steady. It will continue, pick up where it left off when a woman starts puberty. And then it will continue this process until she enters menopause. A couple things to note. Through the process of oogenesis, you start with one daughter cell. Now you still end up with 4 cells. However, notice at the very bottom where it shows, it calls 3 of the smaller cells polar bodies. Those polar bodies, because when the cell divides early on, it's not an equal division, what's going to happen is of the 4 cells produced, only 1 is living. 3 of them will die off. The other thing is to keep in mind for women, yes, it's true, the ovum or the eggs that you have that were produced during fetal development, what you have at birth is what you've got. You do not continue to make brand new ones throughout your life. What you have at birth is what you have. Once you go hit puberty, then those every month will start to pick up where they had left off in development and then will mature from that point on.